Hello, hello. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Jeff Collins, professor at Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of Director Susan Soros and all my faculty colleagues, I am overjoyed to welcome you to this 18th year of the Françoise and Georges Selz Endowed Lectures in 18th and 19th Century French Decorative Arts, Design, and Culture. It's just amazing to see people actually in a room listening to intellectual exchange. So since it's been a while since we've met in person and in something resembling our normal format, I'd like to remind everyone, including newcomers, that this ongoing series was endowed by BGC supporters Bernard and Lisa Selz in honor of Bernard's parents, Georges and Françoise. And it allows us to host lectures by distinguished scholars of French visual and material culture, a wonderful addition to our teaching and research program. And I'm happy to say that in just a few weeks, we'll be hosting Charlotte Vignon, who many of you will know from her time at the Frick and as an adjunct faculty member at Bard Graduate Center. In fact, she's still on our executive board, and we will be welcoming her back in her capacity as director of the French National Ceramics Museum at Sèvres. And her Selz lecture, which is part of a new residency program, will take place in the regular evening slot, so Tuesday, March 1st at 6 p.m. and her talk will be called Rebuilding the City of Ceramics, Projects for the New Sèvres Museum. Today's talk, though, is scheduled sandwiched in between classes, and we will need to end by about 1:15 or 1:20. In terms of logistics, we have a good-sized audience here in the lecture hall, and for those of you joining at home, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that I can read your questions out to the speaker as time permits. We also have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC caption at the bottom of your screen. So today's talk is a much anticipated event that was originally scheduled to happen just a few days after the Great Shutdown in March of 2020. So we're exactly 23 months behind schedule. And finally catching up. Our guest is Professor Sarah Cohen, a renowned specialist in French art and culture, who is professor of art history and chair of the Department of Art and Art History at the State University at Albany, with an adjunct appointment in women's, gender, and sexuality studies. Cohen earned her BA at Oberlin, PhD from Yale, where she was legendary in my own time there, as she is at Bard Graduate Center, having visited us first in 2007 and most recently by Zoom, did a class visit during the pandemic while we were waiting for public events to resume. Professor Cohen is the author of a groundbreaking study on art, dance, and the body in French culture of the Ancien Regime, Exhibit A at the podium, published by Cambridge University Press in 2000, and this publication kept a series of focus studies on the body, culture of the body, its movement, its adornment. I highly recommend it to you. Other publications include Rubens's France, Gender and Personification in the Marie de Medici Cycle, and numerous studies of French painters, including Watteau, Oudry, and Chardin. Among the latter is her prize-winning article, Chardin's Fur, Painting, Materialism, and the Question of the Animal Soul, which won the Clifford Prize from ASEX, and led to her most recent project and publication on animals and the ways they were understood, represented, and marshaled in the service of evolving social and intellectual ideas in the first 6 decades of 18th century France. That is Exhibit B, which resulted here in this book, Enlightened Animals in 18th Century French, in 18th Century Art, Sensation, Matter, and Knowledge. Today's talk is a new project that speaks equally to the moral dimension that underpins much of Sarah's work and resonates with BGC's own commitment to expanding traditional discourses around even traditional decorative arts, both by scrutinizing how objects participated in regimes of oppression and by recognizing the ways that materially grounded studies can operate in the service of healing. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Sarah Cohen.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you very much to all of you for coming out today. I want to emphasize that this project is very much a work in progress. There are a lot of fairly open-ended strands in my research. And so I truly welcome your feedback for the numerous questions and issues that these curious objects raise. I am very excited about the first publication in which my research on the objects will appear. And this is an article, it's a collaborative article for the upcoming issue of Studies in 18th Century Culture. And our provisional title is Removing the Raw: Commodity Chains in the Global 18th Century. And in this article, we have 4 contributors, and we address different commodities and different methods of exploitation of these commodities. So we address the extraction of silver, primarily from Peru, the attempted transport of French spice plants to their Caribbean and South American colonies, the Dutch exploitation of mother of pearl, a fascinating substance that I'm learning a lot about that from that particular scholar. And then my objects, which are, and I'll, let's see, my objects, which deal with the actual delivery of sugar to the French dining table. But of course, in their iconography, they circle back to the actual harvesting, original harvesting of this sugar by enslaved African people. So they really, these objects kind of come full circle through the medium of ultra refined luxury arts. Through they're composed of silver. And I just want to very quickly mention the research from which I have benefited. These objects are currently on display in a fascinating exhibition at the Louvre. I, of course, did not get to see this exhibition, but they have a very good catalog by the Louvre curators, Philippe Malgour and Jean-Luc Martinez. And it's called Venue d'ailleurs. And essentially, it is an exhibition of objects that come from all over, all of which address international, indeed global commerce and exchange. And the chronological period, it extends over a very broad period. And there are all different kinds of art and artifacts, but these objects, there's a very good entry on these objects, and they're kind of put in context in a way that I have found very, very useful. Also, I'm looking forward very much to a new catalog that's going to come out on the gold and silver decorative arts at the Louvre by the curator in charge, Michel Bambinet-Privat, and that's coming out in October of this year. And she already has been very helpful to me in guiding my research. And finally, in terms of the general research on representations of enslaved Africans, and very particularly the delivery of sugar through the representations of enslaved Africans, I am, of course, indebted to the work of Adrian L. Childs, who has been researching this subject for years. Now, what these objects are sugar, essentially, they are sugar casters. And typically sugar casters during this era did exist in pairs on the dining table. And these indeed are paired. There is a male figure and a female figure, and they are in silver. The bodies actually are solid silver, the bodies of the figures, and the sugar cane bundles that they carry on their backs are hollow with a detachable lid so that you can remove the top of the sugarcane bundle, add your sugar, which would probably be a highly refined white powdered sugar, replace the cap, and then as you can see, there are holes through the sugar cane in the top. And so what you would do is the body would remain still on the table and you would presumably detach the bundle of sugar cane and shake the sugar over your dessert, your fruit primarily, which is what was consumed with sugar during this era, although they were starting to consume other kinds of dessert delicacies during this time. And so that's what these objects are, and they are quite large. They are about 11 inches tall, and sugar shakers did tend to be fairly large on the dining table. And but these are freestanding, I might note as well. There were a lot of sugar shakers that formed part of the surtout, the centerpiece with other kinds of condiment vessels, but these were intended to be freestanding. We know nothing more about what context in which they might have been displayed or used. And we do not know who made them. They lack the poinçon or the stamps that would tell us who made them. And they also lack the duty stamps for paying the duties on the silver. So somehow they managed to bypass the rules for stamping this kind of luxury silver object. However, one thing we're pretty sure we do know is who commissioned these works, who owned these works. And this was Louis-Henri, the Duke de Bourbon. He was technically the Prince de Bourbon, but he went by the title of Duke. And in his inventory after his death in 1740, these were listed at Chantilly, his residence, and they were listed as two figures of Moors, very common term used to describe Black figures, bearing sugar canes in silver. And then it gives the weight, which in fact was very, very heavy, much heavier than the standard weight of sugar shakers at this time. And the Gérard Mabille, who was the curator at the Louvre when these originally were acquired in the early 1990s, has attributed the maker as Claude de Bala, the second Claude Bala, who was one of the most prominent silver designers in the 18th century. He had a very long working career and he was extremely prolific. And I think one of the very telling things about Bala that makes him particularly likely as the artisan who made these works is that although he was an official a silver maker to the king, he had a lot of external commissions for some of the highest aristocrats and royalty in Europe. So his production was international and extensive and of the highest elite. He also specialized in figural, very detailed figural renderings. As you can see, these objects are. And he also was a very innovative designer of the surtout, of the dining centerpiece with its various accompanying condiment receptacles. So he is a very likely candidate as the maker of these objects. Now, obviously, questions immediately arise about these objects, very problematic questions. They depict the actual coerced labor of enslaved Africans on the Caribbean sugar plantations. And in 1730, by far the most important of these for France was their island of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue would be the very likely source for the sugar that was contained in these objects. The iconography of these objects to represent the coerced African labor in the form of sugar shakers is unprecedented and obviously extremely curious and problematic from our standpoint. Their costumes are essentially cliche American costumes with the feathered skirts and the feathered hats that would identify them with the New World in general, with literally no consideration of what the actual enslaved Africans wore when they were harvesting the sugar. So already there's a kind of obfuscation of the actual situation. Nevertheless, they do bear the sugar cane on their backs. They hunch over under the weight of the sugar cane, and their expressions are not cheerful and with the kind of accessible sort of personality that one might expect from somebody arrayed in American costume for the entertainment of French diners, but rather there are expressions of, I think, fairly realistic expressions of someone who is actually laboring. Just very quickly, the woman is also wearing jewelry that is very standard to prints, European prints of Africans. And the jewelry that was associated with Africans according to the travel prints of that it really go all the way back to the 16th century. Now, there are quite a number of lines in my own research. One of them is the luxury market, which of course was constantly seeking innovative objects. This was the kind of race to constantly innovate in the luxury, the production and sale and commissioning and displaying of luxury objects. Was very important to the kind of culture that the Duc de Bourbon participated in, as well as the other patrons of somebody like Bala. Another line of research, of course, is global connections and exchange, and the whole importation of goods and the way in which the luxury market fashioned itself to accommodate this kind of global exchange. Now, consumption is very interesting to my study because in terms of the luxury market, because sugar was becoming less and less and less of a luxury during this era. Sugar originally in Europe, of course, had been an elite luxury item because it was so scarce and it was associated, it was used in very small amounts and it was considered to be very precious. But by 1730, with the rise in the productions of sugar, especially on Saint-Domingue, it was becoming less of luxury. It was really becoming much more of a common item, certainly for the middle class. And eventually, as we move through the 18th century, even the peasantry, the working class, the urban working class have access to sugar because of the drop in prices. So there was increasingly a disalignment between the luxury market and the sugar market. And I find this very interesting because this would be a way to recreate the notion of sugar for the elite. So that's another strain in my research. And then yet another strain, which is quite relevant, I think, are the aesthetics of dining rituals, the interplay between objects of use, consumption, and display, and the formalized movements of bodies, actual diners' bodies, the people who used and served these goods, because sugar was very much a part of the theatrics of dining during this era. Now, all of these lines of my research come together in the patron, the very likely patron, the Duc de Bourbon. First of all, he was a great innovator in the luxury market with his manufactory of soft paste porcelain at Chantilly, which emulated the Japanese kakimon style of porcelain that was becoming very popular in France at this era. He also established a manufactory for the imitative painted fabrics that emulated the Indian kalamkaris that were also becoming very fashionable during this era. He was fascinated in global goods. He had mineral and shell collections and other curiosities in his Kunstkammer, and he also collected Japanese porcelain to a very great extent. And then in terms of the theatrics of dining, the Condé family historically was known for the festivities that they held at their residences, specifically around the dessert spectacle. And I'll be getting into that very briefly shortly. Finally, and this I think is extremely important, the Duc de Bourbon had very significant stakes in the Compagnie des Indes, or the India Company, the West India Company, the East India Company, which were united during the period in which he was involved at the court very, very actively. I might mention that he had invested and profited from the John Law's system. And of course, John Law had consolidated the East and West India Companies and under the crown when he was very much in favor. And the Duc de Bourbon had invested heavily and then cashed in just in time. And then in the period after Law, the Duc de Bourbon was very heavily involved in the reorganization of the Compagnie des Indes. And he was involved in various aspects such as the liquidation of debts and other kinds of financial issues that arose in the wake of the John Law system. He was first vice protector and then vice governor of the Compagnie des Indes. And then afterwards, when he served as prime minister to the very young Louis XV from 1723 to 1726, he also was very heavily involved. And then, of course, he was banished to Chantilly. But I think that, in fact, it's not me. It has been suggested in the literature that he was very interested in resuming his profits from the Compagnie des Indes, that he had still a very vested interest in this. And this is an area of my research I would like to explore more. But now I would like to briefly go over and show you some slides and just give you a sense of the various strands of my research as they have been developing. First of all, there is the luxury market itself, small scale figures, very precious figures, primarily German, that I have found that allude in one way or another, in some cases, actually through the very substances that they carry or of which they are composed, that allude to the global trade in precious commodities. So on the left, you see a colporteur, or a traveling salesman fashioned out of elephant ivory with, he's got diamonds, gold, and silver incorporated into this small object. This object, by the way, it ended up in the collection of Marie Antoinette, but that was significantly after the period of, it was after the middle of the 18th century. And one of the panels that he bears on his back, he's bearing a chest on his back with panels in them that you can open up almost like a book. And one of the panels features representations of porcelains, coffee, chocolate, pearls, and various toiletry items crafted of gold, all of which, of course, are global commodities. So he's very much advertising his wares as the marketer of the global exchange. And then the object on the left, fashioned by Balthazar Permoser for Augustus the Strong. It's one of many objects fashioned for Augustus the Strong that alludes, obviously it is, supposed to represent a Black African figure bearing a tray with Colombian emeralds on it. So he's literally bearing the substance, the mineral substance. So these are some precedents for the sugar casters in terms of being very precious objects that have some kind of global raw commodity, originally raw commodity, organic commodity in this case, but it is very highly refined. Also, I think that it is different from the objects we just looked at in that it contains actual imported sugar and depicts actual enslaved labor. In a certain strange way, these objects are more realistic. They're not realistic, but they're more realistic than the ones, they allude more directly to the contemporary situation than the objects that we just looked at. They also depart very significantly from the typical shape of a sugar caster. Sugar casters were becoming fashionable and of use on elite dining tables, but they were almost always in baluster shape. And this pair on the left from the Met by Nicolas Beignet, this is a pair that is quite typical actually. And they are cast in silver. And as you can see, they're like our modern day sugar shaker, except they're much larger and they're in a very refined material. And the sugar caster on the left is actually a soft paste porcelain sugar shaker, sugar caster that was made in the Duc de Bourbon's soft paste porcelain factory at Chantilly. And although it's different, it's painted in the Japanese style, emulating Japanese wares. It does assume that baluster shape, which is so typical of the typical French sugar caster. Now, the sugar caster, as I say, it had come into fashion in the last quarter of the 17th century. And just a couple of items of popular culture that indicate its popularity of the sugar caster that I think are in their own ways very telling and important to my own research. And one you see in the left-hand illustration, the almanac for the year 1682. And here you can see that on the table, there's a ball going on. So it's a nighttime event. And they're preparing for a collation or collation, an evening festive meal that would typically contain sweet delicacies. And so a servant is coming in bearing a great pyramid of fruit. And then on the table, very prominently placed, is a sugar caster. And I think the fact that the sugar caster is so prominently placed really indicates to us that this is a kind of a new object that is worthy of placing almost near the central line of the almanac illustration. And then very curious, and I'm still trying to parse this very long poem that appeared in the Mercure Galant, which had a fairly widespread distribution at this point from January 1681. This is the fable of the Sallière and the Sucrier. And the Sallière, of course, was the salt server. And it's a very long poem, but I'll just give you the basic gist of the poem. The Sucrier is a newcomer to the buffet, which is the cabinet in which these objects are stored, the objects for the dining table. He's a newcomer and he feels very humble. In fact, he even compares himself to this little miserable valet. You know, he doesn't have any status yet in the buffet. And he falls in love with the Sallière because she is this great queenly object of use. And indeed, the Sallière had long assumed a very important place on the European dining table because salt had so much significance. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that phenomenon. Anyway, after a long exposition about how in love with the Sallière the Sucrier is, the key incident is that the officier, or the steward in charge of dessert, mixes up the salt and the sugar. He puts the sugar into the salt container and he puts the salt into the sugar container. And they don't explain what happens when the sugar is used thinking it's salt, but they do explain what happens when the people, the diners, they shake the they use the sucrier to try to sweeten their cream to have with their fruit. And an uproar ensues from this. And they are punished. The sucrier and the Sallière are very severely punished for this. They are blamed. The whole thing is very anthropomorphized. And the sucrier's punishment, and I don't know if this is significant or not for my research. I would love to hear your response to this, but the sucrier's punishment is that he forever afterwards in the buffet, he has to remain under the watchful eye of the vinegar server. And he lives in constant fear that he's going to be pecked by the vinegar server. I guess with the spout of the vinegar server that it will give him pecs. And the Salière, meanwhile, is never seen again. She's banished, and she's replaced by little measly salt servers that have none of her class and her regal qualities. So there's that, which I find very interesting in terms of giving us some hints as to the significance of the sucrier. Then there is the actual way in which sugar participated in the physical performed activities of the court. And what we're seeing here is actually a fete that took place at Chantilly. And this fete was held by Henri Jules, who was the son of the Grand Condé, and he was the grandfather of Louis Henri, who was the person who very likely commissioned the sucrier that I am studying. And this took place in a festivity in the evening time at a festivity of 1688. And it took place in the center of the labyrinth at Chantilly. So all of the guests at Chantilly at this fete had to make their way through the labyrinth until they finally found the center of the labyrinth. And there was an elaborate display. And you could see that the bowls of fruit, those are silver bowls of fruit that are laid out, or baskets of fruit. And there are various condiments placed around here. And the whole thing is arranged as if it's a garden parterre. So it's incredibly stylized, incredibly integrated with the gardens, and also, I think, very importantly, with the physical progress through the gardens and the theatrics of the entire event. And perhaps actually, there's one more thing that I wanted to mention before we move to the next illustration. And I think this is an important point as well, one of the features that unites sugar, silver, and spectacle in the French courtly literature is the idea of shine and reflection. And this is illustrated in a description of a collation given by Louis XIV at Fontainebleau in 1677. And the writer in the Mercure Galant writes about the lights of the candles, the crystal of the candelabra, the gold of the candlesticks. And he says, the reflection from the luster of the caramels, themselves already brilliant, and from the crystallized sugar of the glistening preserved fruit. And so there's this idea that they're trying to emphasize that sugar itself could take on the properties that linked them very closely with the aesthetics of the other decorative arts that were used in the theatrical production, what I'm calling a kind of implicit theatrical production of the collation given by Louis XIV. So that, I think, is another element that is important to consider in relation to sugar and silver and performance. And finally, most problematic, actually, of all of this is the gallant festivity that was held in the Prince de Condé's apartment at Versailles in 1683. And this was the Grand Condé, who died in 1686. So the collation in the labyrinth that we just looked at, that was actually the production of his son at Chantilly. This production was held in the apartments at Versailles by the Grand Condé himself, and it was intended to entertain the king. And this has been addressed in very interesting detail by Meredith Martin and Gillian Weiss in their new book that's just come out, The Sun King at Sea. And they have also addressed this in other publications. And I have learned a lot from their analyses. All of this was also very described in very great detail in the Mercure Galant. Typically, it was a very long fete that moved from room to room in the apartments. All of the guests were disguised and masked, and that was due to the universal masking mandate that took place at this time. The Princess of Conti was dressed as the so-called Queen of the Gypsies, and her attendants were represented as Egyptien and Egyptienne, which was one of the terms used to describe the Gypsies or the Roma people. More commonly used term was Bohemian, and that actually was a very typical masquerade disguise during this era. Meanwhile, beneath the Princess of Conti, there were two Moors who were in silver chains, and they were intended to represent enslaved Blacks placed in these silver chains beneath her feet. So the notion of enslavement is literally performed here in the festivity that took place. Meanwhile, a collation at one point in the ball, a collation was served by a group of 12 officiers or dessert servers of the king. They were all dressed as Moors, or what the Mercure called imitation Moors, but they were interspersed with actual Moors. So actual Black people, men, who were dressed in all kinds of French get-ups. So various kinds of French or French simulating outfits, presumably to the great hilarity of the company. And you can't really see that. The illustration is too generalized. You can't really see what's going on here, but the description, I think, is probably quite reliable. It is in very great detail. And I think this obviously sets a very important precedent for me in studying the costumed African servers in the dessert spectacle of the sugar shakers that would later be commissioned by the Duke de Bourbon. Now, to give you some sense of the actual Caribbean sugar production, there actually was an extensive literature on the Caribbean sugar production. And the two illustrations that I'm going to show you are actually pre-Saint-Domingue. They're both from earlier in the 17th century. They're both French publications, but they date from earlier, before Saint-Domingue became an official French colony in 1687. And this one, and both of them consolidate the various processes of harvesting and processing and refining the sugar, all of which took place in situ before being shipped out in export. And over here on the right, you can see the harvesters bending over beneath their bundled cane. So, you know, this is an actual task. that was carried out, and there are certain resonances between the body postures, the bundles of sugarcane that we see, and that, of course, is the first step in the the first step in the process is just cutting the cane, which is way over one's head. It's very, very apparently very hard to cut. So that was the first process. And then, cutting it up and bundling it and then hauling it on your back. They did haul some of it by animal transport, but a lot of it was done in this way. By the way, just very quick detail, more women than men worked as laborers, as sugarcane harvesters. And this was because there were both men and women worked as harvesters, but female enslaved people predominated because it was only the men who were trained to do the other more specialized work of the refinement processes. So because they trained the men to do all of that, and they coerced the men to do that, the women were almost exclusively assigned to the field work. And then you can see here, I'm not going to go through it, but other aspects of the production, which even in 1658, when this publication was produced, was pretty sophisticated. And then this is a slightly later one. This has been a very useful source for me. Jean-Baptiste Dutertre's Histoire générale des Antilles. Because he goes into a great deal of detail. And once again, you can see the enslaved people who are hauling the sugar cane, loading it in, setting it down in preparation for the various processes. And once again, we see the white overlords who are directing their activities. Now, of course, the costumes that my sugar casters are wearing is nothing like what you have just seen. What you have just seen is actually accurate, as near as I can tell from the descriptions in the very literature from which the illustrations were taken. Essentially, men and women alike were given cloth, very simple cloth, skirts and loincloths to wear for their work in the harvesting and processing of sugar cane, very, very simple garments. They obviously did not wear this elaborate feathered extravaganza that you see here. They certainly did not wear the jewelry that you see on the female laborer in the sugarcane. However, there is a very interesting use, not only in France and actually in Britain as well, and there's been a lot of good literature on the British ways in which the use of the so-called American costuming with the feathers was used in connection with reference to coerced labor in the Caribbean. And the most prominent representation that I have found is from Jean-Baptiste Labat's publication on his voyages and his actual stay in the islands of America. And this is a frontispiece. It is only from the 1742 edition, so it postdates the sugar casters that I'm studying. Nevertheless, it is close in date. And this man is very likely, according to Andrew Curran, and I follow his lead in that, he identifies this figure who is supporting the frame that holds Labat's portrait, that this is an enslaved African person, and you notice that he is wearing a feathered skirt. So there certainly are parallels for this. And then on the other side, this is actually the frontispiece to Charlevoix's history of the island of Hispaniola, which was the island on which Saint-Domingue existed. Saint-Domingue it essentially is present-day Haiti. So it is the western third of the island of Hispaniola. And this is from exactly the same time as the sugar casters. And you notice over here on the right, there is a very, very dark-skinned individual. It's a little bit hard to tell how we're supposed to identify him as an indigenous person or as an African enslaved person, but he is very, very dark in relation to the very light coloration of the personifications in the center of the image. He also, I think what he's doing is he's binding up a barrel that would be used for transport. And they used these barrels for transporting sugar. And they also used the barrels for transporting other organic products from the Caribbean islands, such as tobacco. And then the American, so-called American costuming and characterizations would continue through the 18th century. And what I find interesting is they were particularly associated with sugar and with desserts. And this is a frontispiece from a very important instructional manual, as Gier says, for those who desire to learn l'office, or the stewardship of desserts, to be a dessert master, essentially. And you can see that it features, this is a detail, and this actually, a window that opens up, this cartouche that opens up, shows us the office, and up above are native characters in their Caribbean attire, so presumably Caribbean attire. It's not Caribbean attire by any means, but that of course is the cliche. So they are acknowledging the source of sugar at any rate in the American colonies, however fictional this association might be. And I think that it is important here that we have, just to go back a sec, a real obfuscation of the coerced slave labor. And this rose in the coerced slave labor rose in direct proportion to the consumption of sugar in Europe. It is astounding how sugar consumption increased in Europe. Even desserts, which started out being just fruit in the later, in the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, the whole panoply of desserts developed. And if you look at tables, and there are very useful tables have been published, you can see that the rise in the consumption of sugar and desserts directly mirrors the rise in numbers of enslaved Africans who were forcibly transported, kidnapped and transported from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean. Again, I find this very interesting. Now, there was this pastoral fantasy of, the pastoral fantasy of servitude at Chantilly would continue and would be manifested in its own way that was very much in keeping with the Condé family. To welcome his new bride, his second wife, to the Chateau of Chantilly in 1728, the Duke de Bourbon commissioned his master of ceremonies to arrange a long procession of performing villagers, gardeners, guardians of the menagerie, and other pastoral folk, and they presented his new bride with fruits, live animals, and prepared meals, staged as a movable fete gallant. And they were all in pairs, which is very typical of the performances of the 18th century, when the male-female pairs increasingly became common in the theater. And I believe that the sugar casters almost are like a continuation of that procession of paired folk who are bringing the delicious foods to Chantilly. And so that is another avenue that I think is important to explore. And then there is, of course, the luxury of the African body that had been exploited in the presentation. You're probably familiar with this portrait of the Duc de Bourbon's sister. This is a posthumous portrait of Mademoiselle de Clermont as a sultana. And Anne Lafont has written very importantly about this work recently. And here we see the sister of the Duc de Bourbon, who is flanked by various servants of color and enslaved people. In fact, in the salon brochure, they said that she was surrounded by slaves. They specifically used that word. And then on flanking her on the outermost edges of the picture are two individuals who appear to be very distinctly of sub-Saharan African origin. And what I find interesting about the depiction, especially of the woman on the right, is that she seems to really underscore the aesthetics of the African body as it was coming to be valued during this era. In his new division of the world, according to the types or races of men, from 1684, Françoise Bernier characterized the African race as exhibiting, and then he went through various characteristics such as dark skin, woolly hair, thick lips, short, flat noses, various features that today we find extremely offensive. But I find this point very interesting for my consideration. A shiny and polished glow of the skin. So he specifically emphasizes that, enhanced by teeth whiter than ivory and oral cavities red as coral. So he is literally associating the African body with precious objects. This very shiny, reflective skin, teeth whiter than ivory, which of course was a precious substance, and the coral of the mouth. And interestingly, I don't think it's an accident that Nattier shows us the white teeth of the slave, the enslaved woman on the right, which of course we're invited to compare with her pearl earring, and to look at the reflective, glistening surface of her body. And of course, this is of great interest to me because of the shine of the silver. How silver, the shine of the silver is so much a part of the sugar casters. And we know that the sugar itself was appreciated for its reflective, glistening capacities. Okay, I have just a couple more points. And if you do need to leave, I will not be offended. Please just get up and leave. I'm very used to that. So please do what you need to do. And I will be very, very brief here. and because I already mentioned this, that the Duc de Bourbon was involved in some really, I think, entrepreneurial kinds of activities with the global market in terms of trying to create his own versions of global commodities. And this is actually very well demonstrated in this decorative panel, which is, of course, a detail from the Grande Singerie at Chantilly from the 1730s. And here we see a likely kind of pseudo portrait of the Duc de Bourbon. And on one side of him is a little monkey who is decorating a vase, as if in allusion to the Chantilly soft paste porcelain factory. And on the other side is another monkey who is painting a canvas, painting of fabric, in alluding to the kalamkaris that were the Indian painted fabrics that were so sought after during the 1720s, as were the Japanese kakimon porcelains. And finally, just on the Duc de Bourbon, I actually have already gone into this, that in fact, I have pretty much stated all of the very important features from his involvement in the Compagnie des Indes through his very, very active role in the court of first the regent, when the regent was basically governing on behalf of the very young Louis XV, and then as prime minister during the first 3 years of Louis XV's rule from 1723 to 26. And the individual, the article that was particularly helpful to me in learning about this, it gets very financial, I have to say. It gets into all of the financial details of what they had to do in reorganizing the companies in the wake of John Law's disastrous, the end to the John Law system. This was an article that appeared at the beginning of the last century, actually, by Albert Girard. And it was he who posited that the Duke very likely had a very personal stake in resuming profits from his capital investments in the Compagnie des Indes. I don't know too much more than that, but I think it is a very, very important lead that I need to follow. He also, interestingly, and this is typical of him, he advocated for the appearance of a shareholder-run institution on the part of the Compagnie des Indes, but it would in fact be under royal control. And this is typical of him. He was actually very conservative for all of his entrepreneurial ventures. But after 1726, he retired to Chantilly and really focused his attentions on building up his collections and his manufactories. So what I've done is I've given you all of the various strands of my research. I realize it's an awful lot and it's very open-ended, but these are the various parts of facets of my research, all of which I think are important to consider in relation to these very problematic, but also very interesting and very, very important objects. So thank you very much.
Still here? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the way you laid out all of the all of the strands that you're exploring, and I feel like we got in on the ground floor on this fascinating project. I'm aware of the time. I know that many of you have to go to class. Some of you have to go to my class, so you're absolved. And in the interest of allowing space and time for others, maybe I would ask you to hold your questions because we're going to have our chance to grill Sarah ourselves. So let me open the floor first to those in the room who will not be attending my class, and floor is yours. Yeah, Aaron.
Thank you very much. It's really rich. It's lovely to see all of the contextualizing material you're bringing to bear on. Ways in which the Duke Bourbon was implicated in these many contexts of collecting objects, of being a patron for producing objects, his in financial investment in the overseas company. And I was wondering whether there's any textual evidence that emerges around him that speaks more to the kind of moral dimensions of colonization and slavery. And what I mean by that is, I was thinking right from the start that the material juxtaposition that you laid out for us between this the depiction of the harvesting of the raw material on an object that delivers the refined version of the material, the highly refined, in your language, form of the sugar. And I was thinking about that, the semiotics of that raw and refined, and thinking about what it means racially to exhibit the enslaved African body in these spaces of luxury as a different kind of juxtaposition between colonial discourses, racialized discourses of the raw and the refined, in terms of moral hierarchy, cultural hierarchy. I know this is a bit early period for like what became kind of cultural evolutionary discourses, which made those kinds of moral evaluations and the racialized basis for them very explicit. But I'm wondering if any of the sort of moral dimensions of European colonization show up in this period in the sort of discursive world around the Duc de Bourbon that might provide some insight into what it might have meant to visualize these relationships in these kinds of objects in the spaces that they were.
Yeah. Well, I did hear it. Yeah, thanks. That's a fascinating and important question. I am very eager to get to the Archives Nationales and to Chantilly to be able to see, to do some more primary research, which I have not yet been able to do because for obvious reasons. And perhaps something will be revealed to be there. It actually is surprisingly hard to get anything on him from this side of the Atlantic. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to learn more about him. In terms of the discourse about, if I'm getting your question right, there are a few parts to it. And in terms of the discourse about the moral issues surrounding race and racial hierarchy, that has not yet entered into common discourse. In fact, the Bernier is somewhat unusual in being so relatively definitive about categorizing people according to what we might call the sort of visual, physical characteristics, including color. Because I have found that it really shifts and changes in the course of the 18th century. It's only a gradual process. And this is something that the literature, especially on Britain, which I think is a little more extensive on this question, that it has emphasized as well, that in the first half of the 18th century, we're really in a process there. In terms of the raw and the refined, however, I am very curious to know if there is an aesthetics of whiteness associated with the refinement, because indeed, I'm sure you're aware, the more refined sugar is, the whiter it is. And there was no question that the more refined sugar was, the more expensive, status laden, and as to whether that was specifically equated with whiteness in relation to darkness that in turn could be associated with the human body, that is something that I have to say I'm not sure in this period because it is so early. Jeffrey?
Sorry, having said I was going to leave time for everyone in the room, there's some interesting questions from the audience outside the room that I think bear on this. And I just want to thank you for picking up on this question of refinement, because the spiraling notions of that in the course of the 18th century are, I think, part of what we're talking about, and whether they're how the physical refinement goes with cultural and racial refinement. And one of the fascinating questions that has come is about, Sarah, all of your comments about the luminousness of sugar, the shine of sugar, the shine of African bodies. This is a question about the shine of silver, and wondering if the designer and user of these objects is anticipating that they will blacken over time as they tarnish, and that they need to be continually polished, refined. In other words, that to remain gleaming and white is a process of constant labor. Thank you. Different kind of labor than is pictured here. And then two other audience members from outside have written in asking, you did not show two other pairs of objects that everyone, I think, in the room is thinking about, which is the pair of sugar casters at the Getty, and then the similar pair at the Wadsworth Athenaeum that are lacquered with brown skin tones. And I believe, if I remember, that the Getty ones actually are lacquered bronze, not silver. So, and they are in a Chinese style. And is this part of this story?
It is. It's part of my research, actually.
Evolution, refinement, culture, etc. That's the question. It's not a question. It's a constellation of comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, indeed. His team of servants would have been very busy keeping these fully polished, I'm sure, in the chateau. And by the way, I'm not certain these were ever used because they are such objects of luxury and so unusual, so sculpture-like. I'm not 100% sure they were actually used. That I don't know. I would, when I go to France, I really want to ask the curators what they think about that question. In terms of those, the Getty and the Wadsworth, Chinoiserie, Vernis Martin versions that are, in one case, weirdly, it's cold painted silver. That's in the Wadsworth. And in the Getty, it's bronze. And yes, those actually are the second chapter of my research. And I have put that to one side for the time being because it just adds on too much. But I have addressed it to some extent. And I'm very interested in the racialization of the Chinese body and the way that began to be cast specifically as brown, as kind of a dark brown color, especially in France, moving through the 18th century, which of course contrasts with their prototypes in actual Asian art, which are white, which tend to be white. And yeah, although Linnaeus starts calling them yellow and brown. I don't know how much you rely on Linnaeus, but but when he starts categorizing different races of people, he shifts around, but he starts trying to, I think he finally resolves on yellow, that the various colors are red, yellow, black, and white. But I'm remembering here, I'm not certain. But definitely those are equally problematic to these objects.
Since you're going to be in the class, I'm going to ask you to hold. All right, in that case, in the final moments, let me go to a couple of interesting questions. Some I think can be answered quickly. Here's a factual question that I think maybe some others have had. You were assuming that the skirts are feathers. Jacqueline Bishop is asking, are they in fact African bark cloth?
Are they what, Jeffrey?
African bark cloth.
Well, it's hard to tell. I think they look an awful lot like the stereotypical feather skirts of the other characters that we see that are supposed to be generic American characters. These kinds of no, they're a little bit different, actually. Yeah, I mean, some of them are very generalizing, like here, this one on the right. This one actually literally looks like feathers. These are a little hard to distinguish. Yeah, they are.
I would say you've made the
They're
case.
longer and more layered.
I would say you've made the case that they're feathers, and it raises the last issue I'll just raise based on synthesizing a number of questions that have come in, is really about how much was known. How much was known in Europe about the conditions of enslaved peoples in the islands?
About what?
About the conditions of enslaved peoples in the Americas.
Yeah.
And then I wonder, is there a similar iconography of Africans in Africa wearing different things such that these American costumes clearly indicate that they are enslaved and working in the Caribbean?
Well, first of all, the Europeans were actually pretty well informed of the specifics about what slaves wore in the Caribbean, because somebody like Dukedom has whole chapters on what the enslaved people wore, how many, and in fact, it's codified in the Code Noir. It specifically said, you have to provide this every year. They were constantly not doing it, but they were supposed to provide these certain bolts of cloth for them to use. And Dutertre is very specific about what they wore. And it is these simple cloth garments, as I mentioned. In terms of the travel prints, those are the ones that they tend to be rather fanciful. It's a little hard for me to tell how accurate those are, but they tend to show, they emphasize jewelry, especially on the women, very similar to the jewelry that this woman wears, with the armbands and the necklaces, but the clothing is minimal in the African travel prints. I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but the clothing is quite minimal. They tend to have very, very simple loincloths, or really, really simple skirts. But essentially nudity tends to be the predominating factor in the African travel prints that I have seen, but it's a big area because African travel prints had been being produced since at least the 15th century. So there's a long tradition and they imitate one another too. So it gets kind of complicated.
And draw this to a close. Thank you very, very much for your contribution. Thank you all for attending. Thank you everyone who wrote in dozens of questions I wasn't able to answer or relay to the speaker. It's definitely a sign of interest in your work. I invite you to attend our next Selz event as discussed, and have a wonderful afternoon.